I'm Rob Bell, an engineer with a thirst for understanding how things work. Join me on a journey to investigate the incredible structures that have stood the test of time and their ground during what was to become a global war. (1940), following the fall of France and the devastating defeat at Dunkirk, Britain stood alone against the onslaught of the unstoppable Nazi menace. With her back against walls not yet built, construction began on an epic project, transforming this green and pleasant land into an impregnable island fortress.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
Churchill's rousing speech of defiance laid out the plan for Britain's defence. Each week, I'll be exploring the streets, hills, and landscape he spoke of to uncover the monumental, mysterious, and heroic buildings that helped us win the war. Today, nearly 80 years later, thousands of seemingly random structures still litter our countryside. In many cases, they're just blocks of concrete you might see during a daily commute or pass by on a weekend walk. But if you know what you're looking at, behind these remnants of bricks and mortar, there's a much darker story to be told. It's a tale of terror and fear. At a time when fascism overran the rest of Europe, Britain stood alone. Today, often all that's left to remind us of those dark days are these crumbling remains. But in their day, they were the buildings that fought Hitler. In the summer of 1941, the threat of invasion massively receded when Hitler attacked the Soviet Union. But by Christmas, the attack had ground to a halt at the gates of Moscow. Meanwhile, America had entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, Britain no longer stood alone. It was time for the Allies to go on the offensive, which meant the buildings that housed the Navy and the Air Force were about to come into their own. Much of the story of Britain's war up to this point had been about holding on, surviving against the odds, fighting with our backs to the wall. But there was one part of Britain's war effort that far surpassed the Germans from the very start, and where they never really came close to closing the gap. Britain had ruled the waves for 500 years, and during World War II, once again, it was time for the senior service to set sail and safeguard our shores.
People often forget that, yes, it was a phony war on land from the outbreak of war. The war at sea was far from phony. The Royal Navy was in action from September 1939 to August 1945.
The German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, was much weaker than the Royal Navy. There had been an Anglo-German naval rivalry, which was one of the kind of origins of the First World War. It wanted to rival Britain's Navy, but never could.
The Royal Navy was the world's largest in 1939, and it's often forgotten that although Britain had a very, very small army, traditionally it always had done, but it did have the world's largest merchant fleet, and it had the world's largest navy. So Britain was in a very good position, really, in many ways, in 1939.
The Navy was without doubt the largest and the best equipped of the three services when the war began, and it continued to grow throughout the war. But a beast this big needs to be provisioned. And if you know where to look, some of the most extensive remaining structures from the war are all about ensuring Britain continued to dominate the Germans at sea. This is Caerwent in Monmouthshire, just 4 miles from the Severn Road Bridge.
This is a factory for making cordite, so propellant for shells, naval shells, that was built at the beginning of the war and was fully functioning by 1941, and it's absolutely vast. Really, it's one of these extraordinary places in Britain that no one ever knows about, and no one's ever heard about, but there's over 400 buildings that back in the day were producing vast amounts of cordite. When one thinks of the Second World War, you tend to think of Spitfires or people jumping out of landing craft or bomber crews or whatever it might be. The Navy is kind of the bit that you think about least, and what you really don't think about are the factories and all the kind of infrastructure and vast amounts of building work that was going on in Britain to help further the war effort.
The site at Caerwent was commissioned in 1939 and completed in 1941. One of the reasons the site was chosen was that the area is one of the cloudiest places in Britain, making it difficult to find and difficult to bomb. This provision seemed to have worked. At 600 hectares, it's one of the largest military sites in Britain. Yet throughout the war, it was never bombed. The Germans simply didn't know it was there.
This is the point I always think gets really left out of the narrative of the Second World War, is what is broadly considered the operational level. So you have a strategic level, tactical level. Strategic is the kind of overviews, the tactical is the actual fighting bit. The operational level is those nuts and bolts, and Caerwent is an absolute classic example of that. Not only are you building 400 buildings, you've then got to equip those buildings. You've then got to create a workforce, transport them there, house them, feed them, so that they can then produce this cordite. I mean, it's an immense operation.
Caerwent made the cordite that allowed the Royal Navy to fight back at sea. Cordite is a refined version of gunpowder and was needed in huge quantities to propel the large naval guns. When fully operational, the site could produce 150 tons of cordite a week, requiring 3 million gallons of drinking quality water per day to ensure the cordite's purity. With cordite, quality was everything. The cordite charge had to be identical every time a shell was fired, so the gunners could hit their target with accuracy in the heat of the battle.
If you really want to know how good the Navy was, I'll give you one example. So between Omaha Beach and Gold Beach, there was a German series of guns called Long-Sous-Mer. These were high-caliber naval guns, and they had to be knocked out. And you can go there today, and you can still see the casements, these big concrete casements in which these guns were sort of enclosed, and you can see the guns themselves. And on one of the guns, if you look at it, you can see the shield around it has been smashed. And on the side of the breech of this gun is this big kind of cigar-shaped kind of divot that's been just gouged out of the breech. And that has knocked that gun out of action. That gun is no longer working. And that was a single shell fired by HMS Ajax, which was a British cruiser, from about 6 miles out at sea. No laser-guided missile or anything like that. That is just pure gunnery skill to fire that one with that level of accuracy. It's absolutely stunning, and people just take it for granted.
The role of silent, forgotten places like Caerwent made the battle at sea possible. And yet now they're all but lost to the mists of time as nature reclaims the land. But there are other places where the pomp and the pride of the British Navy can still easily be seen. Places that were the last stop before the vessels headed off beyond the blue horizon. The Navy was the jewel in Britain's military crown, but its contribution to World War II was so efficient it's sometimes overlooked. At the start of the war, the naval forces were divided into 3 equal divisions, each based out of one of the royal dockyards: Portsmouth, Plymouth, and Chatham.
This isn't a dockyard that was built for the Second World War. This is a dockyard that has a history that goes right back to Stuart times. It goes back to the time when the Dutch attacked the Navy on the Medway in the 1660s. It goes through all the long 18th century real worldwide wars before we called them world wars. It served the Navy again in the First World War, so it comes into the Second World War, particularly this part of the dockyard, as a dockyard of the age of sail that's still working to build, repair, maintain ships and submarines for the Royal Navy.
Britain's a maritime nation, and it's always prided itself on its navy. The shipbuilding going on between the wars was just immense. And so therefore you've got the biggest navy in the world by an absolutely massive margin.
Shipyards are making their tremendous contribution, sending new men of war down the slipways to guard the freedom of commerce, and feverishly building new merchant tonnage to replace the losses by mine and U-boat warfare.
Because of its imperial commitments, the British Navy was dispersed, and that meant that it was very difficult to bring them together to defend the country in the summer of 1940.
In the early years of the war, when the Navy and Britain are very much on the defensive, Chatham is repairing ships like Cavalier, a destroyer behind me, repairing ships that are damaged in battle, things like those that were sunk or damaged in the Norway operations in 1940. Dunkirk, clearly. We then go through the Battle of the Atlantic. It's a relentless campaign, so a lot of the work that a dockyard like this is doing is just the relentless efforts of trying to keep these ships at sea.
The Battle of the Atlantic was the campaign to keep the shipping lanes to North America open, so Britain could import men and materials from Canada and the US. The Royal Navy fought a relentless battle to stop the U-boat sinking merchant shipping. To keep a fleet as big as the British Navy at sea took a vast amount of infrastructure back on land. The buildings, workshops and dry dock of Chatham are what made the triumphs at sea possible.
As we go through past 1943 into 44 and 45 and the tide of war swings, then Chatham's putting ships out as part of the offensive action against the German regime and the Italian regime, and indeed out into the Far East.
It's hard to overstate just how important the buildings at Chatham were. The docks would have been a hive of activity as they sought to keep the ships at sea.
We think about 17,000 people were employed here then. As the war went on, a lot of those manual and skilled tasks were passed on to female workers as well as the traditional male workers. Everybody is completely focused on the war effort. Ships will be in all the dry docks. We'd had ships in the river. We'd had the crews from those that were in the basins. And the actual Chatham Division barracks themselves, filling the local towns in the evenings, and pubs and music halls and things. Although the dockyard wasn't particularly hit by a large number of air raids or bombs directly, the Medway towns were, so people are doing their jobs by day but also living at night under aerial bombardment.
The feeling in Chatham in the early part of the war was that the docks were spared significant bombing because the Germans wanted to keep them intact for a possible invasion. Whether that was the case, we'll never know. But as time wore on, Chatham's ships started to inflict real damage on the enemy.
So this is the National Destroyer Memorial. Cavalier is preserved here as the National Destroyer Memorial. This is the monument that goes with it. And it records the names of the 142 destroyers lost with about 11,000 men during the Second World War. The list's divided into years of loss. You can actually see the way the war waxed and waned over those 5 years. Not very many lost in 1939, a big bunch in 1940 that includes the operations to take the men off the shore at Dunkirk. We see the loss of Crete in 1941. You can see from 1942 it's one of the biggest years of losses. So this is really when the Battle of the Atlantic and the Arctic convoys were at their height. Then through 1943, Mediterranean again, through to 1944 and D-Day. The thing to me that brings this home and how many ships went down is that you get something like HMS Hardy here, lost during 1940. They built another ship called HMS Hardy. She was lost in 1944.
It wasn't unusual for the Navy to have several successive ships with the same name. What is unusual is for two ships with the same name to be lost so close together. Although the ships based out of Chatham were present in every theatre of the Second World War, there was one battle that stands out. The Battle of the Atlantic.
The Battle of the Atlantic is, without a shadow of doubt, the most important theatre in the entire Second World War. Because if the Atlantic is lost, that means all those sea lanes going across the Atlantic, and indeed from all around the world back to Britain, are lost as well. It means Britain's then cut off, can't do what it wants to do, and there'll be no reinvasion of the continent, etc., etc. There'll be no build-up of American forces, there'll be no strategic air campaign, any of it. So making sure that those supply lines across the Atlantic continue, it's incredibly important. And of course, everyone forgets about that because you can't really kind of get on a ship all the way to the mid-Atlantic, gaze out to sea and go, God, amazing what happened here, because all you're looking at is sea. And it's forgotten about. And yet, it wasn't until the Battle of the Atlantic was won in May 1943 that you could properly start planning. Because if you want to plan really serious invasions like Sicily or southern Italy, or indeed Overlord going into Normandy, for example, in D-Day, you really need to know that 98% of your supplies are going to get through. Otherwise, that just cocks the whole thing up. If you can keep those sea lanes open, you can get access to literally anything you want. And in a long, attritional, drawn-out war, which is what the Second World War becomes, the side that can continue the supply lines and continue to get the resources it needs is going to win. And the fact that Britain can get fuel, bauxite, copper, wood, food, steel, means that you are in the driving seat when it comes to pushing forward and winning the war ultimately.
Without the men and the ships sailing out of places like Chatham, we'd have been unable to challenge the U-boat wolf packs that stalked the Atlantic and could easily have been starved into submission. But even the most powerful navy was useless without good intelligence. And luckily, the British had a few aces up her sleeve in that department too. For many years after the war, the stories told about how we defeated the Nazis were the stuff of boys' own adventures. The few in their Spitfires and Hurricanes, the desert rats at El Alamein, and the commandos storming the beaches of Normandy. But in the 1970s, a new and equally adventurous story started to emerge. It was the tale of how a group of intellectual misfits and dedicated WAAFs, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, had played a much larger role in defeating the Nazis than was previously imagined. In 1938, with war seeming inevitable, certain government departments started planning for the worst. Admiral Hugh Sinclair, director of the Secret Intelligence Services, needed a safe place to house one of his units, the Government Code and Cipher School.
In 1938, all the different organs of government are looking for places out of London where they can set up work to avoid getting bombed.
The house he chose was Bletchley Park. Built in 1883, it was on the verge of demolition when Admiral Sinclair bought it for £6,000, a sum he paid out of his own pocket as the government didn't have the available money.
Admiral Sinclair selected it because it was out of London, but unlike a lot of country houses, it wasn't completely in the middle of nowhere. Bletchley Station, which connects directly with Euston, is at the bottom of the garden, and more importantly, the trunk telephone cables that connect London with the north of England run about a quarter of a mile away. And that's really, really important for the site because it's a signals organisation. They rely on getting messages and information into the site and back out again very quickly. Bletchley Park lies at the heart of a very elaborate web, if you like.
Following the outbreak of war, to continue the vital work being undertaken, more space was needed. So within the grounds of this stately home in late 1939, construction began on a series of temporary wooden huts. In all, 16 were built.
People have a perception of Bletchley as being a sort of glamorous place to work full of these intellectuals and mathematicians. There's the association with Alan Turing. He is one of the most famous figures here, and he did a huge amount of important work. But he is one of a team of brilliant individuals, and each of the different cipher systems that were attacked were in the hands of different experts. So Turing is famous for his work on Enigma, along with Dilly Knox, who worked on Enigma before the war and was in fact Turing's boss. But Enigma isn't all Bletchley's doing. They're looking at high-level German ciphers, the famous Lorenz machine, and that was a genius mathematician called Bill Tutt who figured out how to break into that one. And then on the other side, you have all the other codes around. We have Japanese codes, people like Hugh Foss, John Tiltman. It's quite a sort of pantheon of great figures.
We often think that code breaking is all about flashes of intellectual genius. But the reality of what happened in these buildings was often just the day-to-day reality of grinding hard work.
For the vast majority of the workforce, the work must have been very, very dull. The secret of the success of the place is that the processes that are developed by people like Alan Turing or Bill Tutt are actually broken down into a sort of factory production line. And almost everybody, apart from the last person in the line, doesn't see the product. They see their bit of the process. So many, many people would have been doing extraordinarily dull things with columns of numbers and, what appeared to be random letters, inputting them into various mechanical devices, listing them, cataloguing them, and it would have been, frankly, very tedious, but absolutely vital. You weren't allowed to speak about what you did to anybody outside, more or less, the room you were in, and certainly the hut you were in. And I remember reading testimony from one veteran that she had to pass on information on the telephone. And she would make these telephone calls every day for years. She always thought she was phoning London or somewhere exotic. She discovered after the war that she was phoning a hut about 10 feet away. But no one had ever told her who she was phoning up.
Bletchley had a huge workforce of both civilian and military personnel. You have women who were members of the Women's Royal Naval Service that are there operating this complex machinery, and you've got civilian women who answered adverts because they were good at crosswords. And there was a real community that built up around Bletchley. There's a wonderful story of a married couple that didn't know that they both worked at Bletchley until they'd been married for decades.
What happened in the huts at Bletchley Park played a vital role in taking the air and sea war to the Germans. But Bletchley couldn't exist in isolation. However important its role, it could only truly succeed as part of a wider system.
Successful intelligence works best when it's coordinated. There's lots of different types of intelligence. So there's code breaking, which is what they're doing at Bletchley. But there's also the WWII service, for example, which is listening into enemy radio. There's also the incredibly valuable work of RAF Medmenham, which is the high-flight photo reconnaissance units. There's a whole host of other pieces of intelligence as well, from agents in enemy-occupied territory, from interrogations of prisoners. I think the way to look at Bletchley is that it's a very, very, very important, vital cog, but it is only one cog. And British and Allied intelligence works best when you see it as each of those cogs adding up to much more than the sum of their individual parts.
Bletchley is most famous for breaking the secrets of the German Enigma machine. This portable coding device had made it possible for the Germans to send secure messages to and from units on the front line. Vital for conducting blitzkrieg warfare. Work on breaking this code took place here, in Hut 4.
Enigma is a cipher machine. What that means is it takes the letters of a message and replaces them according to a formula with different letters. And so it's superficially very simple. But the secrecy lies in the fact that you can configure the machine in all sorts of different ways. There are rotors inside that can be swapped around, the positions of the rotors change. What that means is, if I were to type one message, there are 103,000 million possible ways of encrypting that message. If you were just to try each possible combination one after another, if you did one test a second, it's something like 300 times the length of the life of the universe. So the Germans were pretty comfortable with this machine being secure.
Bletchley was hit by one stray bomb in 1940, which moved Hut 4 off its foundations by 2 feet. As it was winched back into place, work to crack Enigma carried on inside. This was as close as the Germans got to disrupting the codebreakers' work, and they never realized the danger Bletchley posed to the Enigma code.
They did come to the conclusion that breaking Enigma was theoretically possible, but the conclusion they reached was that actually, to do it effectively, you'd need to build an extraordinarily complicated mechanical device. You'd need multiple copies of that device, and you need thousands and thousands of people. And they kind of said, well, no one's going to do that, are they?
In fact, that was exactly what the British had done at Bletchley. The work culminated in the creation of machines called bombs that checked thousands of possible Enigma settings. These are sometimes regarded as the forerunner to modern computing, and they were housed here in Hut 11.
You have 200 bomb machines and 2,000 wrens clanking away and 24 hours a day churning out key settings. So there was a failure of imagination on the German part of just how much effort the Allies were prepared to put in. And it's that enormous industrial effort that gets the result.
The success of Bletchley was one of Britain's most closely guarded secrets, kept until well into the 1970s. Now, over 80 years later, debate still rages about what the real legacy of Bletchley is. Many of the key people who worked here were instrumental to the birth of computing in the 50s. But under the Official Secrets Act, the work of these key players and the role they played has been hidden for decades.
The other big contribution that Bletchley makes, I think, is to do with information. And what's really striking about Bletchley is it's an organisation that draws in data in enormous volumes. The people at Bletchley find a way of capturing that information, storing it, processing it, turning it into useful intelligence, distributing it to their customers, who are the field commanders and the governments. And so Bletchley's ability to successfully deal with data at scale is really groundbreaking. And I think it's one of the less acknowledged contributions that Bletchley has made to our modern life.
The code breakers at Bletchley would have had no idea what a profound impact their work has had on the world we live in today. During 2020, the COVID pandemic slashed visitor numbers to this historic site, and Bletchley faced closure. But surprisingly, Facebook stepped in with a £1 million donation to secure its future. At the start of the war, the work at Bletchley Park was pivotal to keeping the Atlantic sea lanes open, so essentially ensuring our national survival. By 1943, Britain was no longer alone, yet it still faced an invasion, although this was a friendly invasion, as Americans and their equipment poured into the country to help take the fight back to the Nazis. By 1942, Britain had a major decision to make. How should it take the fight to the Nazis? The Russians were fighting the Germans on land, and so the British decided to put much of their energy into destroying German industry and dehousing her population. The Allied strategic bombing campaign started in earnest, and with the Americans arriving in ever greater numbers, the onslaught on Germany moved to a whole new level. While the British were bombing Germany by night, the Americans were bombing by day. This round-the-clock campaign required an enormous number of bomber bases to be built. Each one became something of a new small town as it established itself in the English countryside. This is one of these bases, Ridgewell in Essex. These buildings were hastily built in 1941 and have since fallen into disrepair. The few that remain are now mostly used for farm storage.
This was a Type A aerodrome when it was constructed at the start of the war. Before the Americans even entered the war, these were being built all over the UK. In fact, the UK was handing over 3 airfields a week in 1941.
The base consists of 3 2,000-metre-long runways. It had 50 individual hardstands for the bombers and 2 vast hangars.
This is a large bomber base. In fact, Ridgewell here is the only one in Essex. The rest are scattered across East Anglia and Suffolk and Norfolk and as far up into Cambridge and Northampton. And we're talking about 67 American airfields with roughly, on a Type A aerodrome, almost 3,000 American servicemen. You know, we're talking 150,000 or more US air service personnel just supporting the air offensive into Germany.
These bomber bases are very different from the fighter airfields used in the Battle of Britain. They're much larger, housing bigger planes which needed more personnel to keep them flying. The bases were built near the east coast of England to be as close as possible to the targets in Germany.
If you were here, let's say in 1943, and you walked down this track behind me, the first thing you'd do when you got through the trees behind me, you'd find the baseball diamond, which is the hub of the airfield, and each bomb group had its own baseball team, and they would fly to each other's airfields and play each other. I mean, the reality of war comes home, though, because you could never make a team selection the same every week because people were being shot down and killed or captured. So the team was never the same from one week to the next.
Facilities at Ridgewell were basic. For these young men, often away from home for the first time, arriving here was a rude awakening.
Living here in 1943 or 1944, you're living in a cold, damp Nissen hut with a log burner stove in the corner. You're getting up at 3 or 4 in the morning to go and fly on a mission that you might not come back from. These crews have got to survive at the start 25 missions, and very, very few did that.
The strategic bombing campaign is a bone of contention amongst modern historians and anybody engaging with that period in history. We've ended up with a war, in many ways, of attrition. Germany's bombing Britain, we're taking the fight back to Germany. We bomb a historic place in Germany, Germany's going to come and bomb our historic places, as in the Baedeker Blitz of 1942, which are specifically designed in an attempt to break British morale.
It's so merciless, this bombing campaign, that it even becomes controversial within Britain. It makes the kind of blitz on London, look like a picnic. And the Germans regard British and American bomber pilots as Terrorfliegen, terror flyers. They regard them with the same opprobrium as today we would regard the terrorist. And so when you did bail out your plane after having bombed a town, and you had been shot down by a Messerschmitt, the chances are you were going to be lynched or shot by the local population.
There are 50 hard standings here at Ridgewell, and each one could hold a B-17 Flying Fortress, which is built by Boeing. As the name implies, it's a well-armed aircraft. It's designed to fight its way through enemy fighters, through enemy flak, and with its northern bomb sights, hit a precision target, and then fly back again and do the same over and over again. This plane is manned by 10 aircrew, a mixture of officers and NCOs, a pilot, a co-pilot, a navigator, an engineer, numerous gunners, tail gunner, a ball turret gunner, a mid-upper gunner, all manning up to 13 machine guns, depending on the version you've got. Flying in mass formation in what's called a combat box formation, where they mutually support each other with those machine guns and take on whatever's thrown at them. If one of those bombers goes down, up to 10 people are going to be killed each time. And it was not uncommon for 7, 8, 9 bombers from one unit to be shot down in a day. OK, this is the chapel, so this is where the bomb group guys would have gone to see the chaplain before a mission. This doesn't look like much now, but this is the chaplain's office for the 381st Bomb Group. And this is where Chaplain Good Brown worked on a daily basis, and where airmen from the bomb group would come to seek solace, comfort, or just a chat in between the missions that they flew from the airfield. So away from the daily grind and away from the casualties and the horror of fighting the war over Germany. The chaplain's diary records going into breakfast the day after a raid, and there being 120 aircrew missing from breakfast. That's a huge chasm in the heart of a squadron or a bomb group. One of the stories that's particular to Ridgewell is the story of the man who came to dinner. At night, people would arrive from Cambridge or wherever by road and be dropped off to join their squadron. One young airman arrives at night, goes to bed expecting to be inducted the next day, and actually he's woken at 3 in the morning to go on a mission, flies off on a mission, his aircraft is shot down, he is killed. Nobody knows his name.
Even before the airmen reached enemy territory, bombing was a dangerous business. Forming up the tight combat formations often led to mid-air collisions, especially during cloudy or foggy weather. And there were occasions where heavily laden bombers would suffer mechanical problems during takeoff, crashing on the airfield while still carrying a full load.
One aircraft, Caroline, crashes at the end of the runway, right at the end of the war, goes in with a full bomb load and explodes on the perimeter of the airfield. Coming back from a mission, an aircraft carrying wounded would fire a flare in it as it flew around in the circuit, and then the ambulances would be waiting, and that aircraft would get priority. Those guys would be taken off the aircraft on stretchers into the ambulances and straight back to the hospital. But the hospital did all the run-of-the-mill daily routine stuff that you would imagine, and one of the most common incidents at Ridgewell was bicycle incidents, because the bicycles here were very different to those in the States. So if an American managed to get out and buy a bicycle or borrow a bicycle from somebody, and you needed one to get around a big airfield, the braking system was very different, stopping with the pedals or using the handbrakes, etc. So the most common injury here was bicycle related, hundreds of them. You can still feel the rhythm of the airfield. If you walk around here, you can read the concrete, you can see where it goes, you can pick out the different sites, you can see the operations cell, and you can walk the perimeter track, and you can feel the space. And if you stand still, it's almost, you can imagine those rows and rows of B-17s taxiing out to go on a mission, or you can stand up where the old control tower used to be and think, well, people stood here and waited to see how many B-17s had made it back. All those ground crew that serviced and armed those aircraft and refueled them were waiting to see if those 10 guys that they looked after were going to make it back that day.
The Allied strategic bombing campaign carried on right up until the end of the war. It claimed the lives of over 150,000 British and American aircrew, as well as over 400,000 German civilians. And whilst these British and American bomber crews fought on from bases right across East Anglia, a new force was building up in the south of the country. D-Day was coming. And right across the south coast of Britain, buildings were being built, repurposed or requisitioned to help launch the greatest and perhaps most innovative invasion ever seen.